Keanu Reeves didn't finish his sentence. Jimmy Fallon's face changed. The audience fell silent. Because the voice that entered the studio belonged to someone no one expected to be there. The cameras were rolling. 200 people sat in the audience, laughing at every joke, applauding at every cue. The Roots were playing their signature upbeat transitions. It was just another Tuesday night at Studio 6B in Rockefeller Center, home of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Everything was going exactly as planned, scripted down to the second. Guests were prepped, jokes were rehearsed, and the energy was electric. But in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, none of that would matter anymore. Jimmy Fallon had interviewed thousands of guests over his career. From presidents to pop stars, from athletes to actors, he had mastered the art of making everyone feel comfortable, of turning every interview into a conversation, every segment into a moment. His desk had seen it all: tears of joy, surprise reunions, unexpected confessions. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his 30-year career in television, had prepared him for what was about to happen when Keanu Reeves sat down in that chair. Keanu walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The audience loved him, not just for his movies, but for who he was as a person. Stories of his kindness had become legendary. Giving up his subway seat, taking pay cuts so crew members could get better salaries, buying motorcycles for his stunt team. He was Hollywood's most beloved human being, and tonight, he was promoting his latest project. Jimmy greeted him with his trademark enthusiasm, the kind of genuine warmth that made guests feel like they were talking to an old friend rather than performing for millions of viewers. They shook hands. Keanu sat down, adjusted his all-black outfit, and smiled that humble smile everyone recognized. "Keanu Reeves, ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy announced, and the crowd erupted again. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. It started as a normal interview. They talked about motorcycles, about Keanu's love for craftsmanship, about the new film. The audience laughed at the right moments. Jimmy's timing was perfect, and Keanu was relaxed, more open than usual. About 6 minutes into the interview, Jimmy asked him about his philosophy on life, about what kept him grounded despite decades of fame. Keanu leaned back, thought for a moment, and began to speak. "You know, Jimmy, I think what matters most is..." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but because something had caught his attention. His eyes shifted slightly toward the audience, to the front row, to a specific seat. Jimmy noticed the pause but assumed Keanu was just gathering his thoughts. He waited, smile still on his face, ready to respond. But Keanu didn't continue. Instead, his expression changed. The lightness in his eyes was replaced by something deeper, something that looked like recognition mixed with disbelief. "Keanu?" Jimmy asked gently, his host instincts kicking in. "You okay, buddy?" Keanu didn't answer. He was staring at someone in the front row. His microphone hand lowered slowly. The audience, sensing something unusual, began to quiet down without being told. The Roots, who had been softly playing ambient music, gradually stopped. Even the camera operator seemed to sense that something unscripted was unfolding. Then, from the front row, a voice spoke. Not loud, not demanding attention, but clear enough that the studio microphones picked it up. "Keanu." It was a woman's voice. Elderly, fragile, but filled with emotion that could shatter glass. The audience turned. Jimmy Fallon turned. The cameras turned. And there, in the front row, stood an old woman, perhaps in her late 70s, with silver-gray hair, wearing a simple floral dress. Her hands were clasped to her chest, and tears were streaming down her face. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Keanu Reeves stood up. Not slowly, not hesitantly. He stood up immediately, dropping the casual demeanor of a talk show guest and becoming something else entirely. A man who had just seen a ghost from his past. Jimmy Fallon, for the first time in years of hosting, didn't know what to do. His cards with prepared questions sat useless on his desk. The teleprompter had nothing for this moment. The producers in the control room were silent, watching their monitors with frozen fingers hovering over buttons they didn't know whether to press. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" Keanu's voice cracked slightly as he said the name. The woman nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Keanu didn't wait for permission. He didn't look at Jimmy for approval. He simply stepped off the stage, walked down the 3 steps that separated the performance area from the audience, and made his way to the front row. Security guards instinctively moved, but Jimmy raised his hand, a silent command to let it happen. The entire studio watched in complete silence as Keanu Reeves reached the old woman and, without hesitation, wrapped his arms around her in an embrace that looked like it was holding together more than just 2 people. It was holding together years, memories, and a story that no one in that room knew but everyone could feel. The woman buried her face in Keanu's shoulder and sobbed. Not quiet tears. Deep, body-shaking sobs of someone releasing decades of emotion. Keanu held her, one hand on her back, one hand cradling her head, and he too began to cry. Jimmy Fallon stood up from behind his desk. His professional mask had completely fallen away. His eyes were wet, his mouth slightly open, and for once, the man who always knew what to say had no words. He looked at his director, at the Roots, at the audience, and made a decision that defied every rule of live television. He walked over to the audience. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. As Jimmy approached, Keanu and Mrs. Hawthorne slowly separated. The woman's makeup was ruined, her eyes red, but there was something in her face that looked like relief, like a weight she had carried for too long had finally been lifted. Keanu turned to Jimmy, his own face streaked with tears, and said something that would later be replayed millions of times across the internet. "Jimmy, this is Grace Hawthorne. 32 years ago, she saved my life." The audience gasped. Not a collective whisper, but a sharp intake of breath from 200 people simultaneously. Jimmy, standing in the audience aisle now, completely off script, off stage, and off balance, asked the only question that mattered. "How?" Grace Hawthorne found her voice. It was shaky but determined, the voice of someone who had come too far to turn back now. "I was a nurse," she began, looking not at the cameras but at Keanu. "I was working the overnight shift at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. It was 1993. You came in, you were—" She paused, struggling with the memory. "I was a mess," Keanu finished for her gently. "I was in a very dark place." Grace nodded. "You came in through the emergency entrance, and you told me you didn't want to be here anymore. You didn't want to be anywhere anymore." The studio had never been this quiet. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "I wasn't supposed to do what I did," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "I was supposed to call the psychiatric team, fill out forms, follow protocol. But I looked at you, and I saw my son. My son who I had lost 3 years earlier, the same way you were feeling. And I couldn't let it happen again." She reached into her small purse and pulled out something. At first, from the camera's distance, it was hard to see what it was. But as she held it up, zooming cameras caught it, a small, worn notebook, the kind that fits in a pocket. "You sat with me for 4 hours that night," Grace said, her voice now steady, clear, carrying across the silent studio. "I wasn't supposed to leave my station, but I sat with you. We talked about everything and nothing. You told me about your dreams, your fears, your guilt, your pain. And I listened. I just listened." Keanu took the notebook from her hands, and his own hands were shaking. "You gave me this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You told me to write one reason to stay every day. Just one. You said it didn't have to be big. It could be as simple as the taste of coffee or the way light hits a wall. You said that after a year, I'd have 365 reasons. Did you?" Grace asked, the question of a lifetime finally spoken. Keanu opened the notebook. Its pages were filled, front to back, with handwriting. "I filled 17 of these," he said. 17 notebooks. Over 6,000 reasons. And it started with this one with what you wrote on the first page." He opened to the first page and read aloud. "You matter. Not for what you do, but for who you are. Write that down until you believe it." The audience erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in sobs. 200 people crying as one. The cameras caught it all, grown men with their faces in their hands, women holding each other, teenagers crying into their phones. The Roots, those cool, composed musicians who had seen everything, were openly weeping. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Jimmy Fallon, standing in the middle of his audience, did something he had never done in his entire career. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, took it off, and draped it over Grace Hawthorne's shoulders. Then he took off his tie, the signature Tonight Show tie that was part of his uniform, part of his brand, part of his identity as the host. He handed it to Keanu. "I don't know the exact protocol for this," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion, speaking to the cameras now. "But I think we're going to take a moment here. I think we're going to stop the show." The control room could have cut to commercial. They could have gone to a pre-recorded segment. But they didn't. The producers, the network executives watching from their offices, everyone made the same decision: let it play out. Jimmy turned to the audience. "Does anyone here have something they want to say? Something they need to say?" For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a young woman in the third row stood up. "My brother was like you," she said, looking at Keanu. "He didn't make it. But your movies, your interviews, the way you talk about mental health, it helped me understand him." "Thank you." Another person stood. Then another. Then another. One by one, people in the audience began sharing their stories. Stories of loss, of survival, of the people who saved them, of the moments that mattered. The Tonight Show, the polished, perfectly timed machine of entertainment, had become something else, a space for healing. Jimmy Fallon stood in the middle of it all, no longer the host, but a participant. He listened to every story, acknowledged every person, held space for every emotion. The cameras kept rolling, but it didn't feel like television anymore. It felt like church. Keanu never left Grace's side. He held her hand through every story, and when the last person sat down, he turned to Jimmy and said, "I never got to thank her properly. I looked for her for years. I went back to that hospital, but she had retired. I hired people to find her, but every lead went cold. I thought maybe it was meant to be a moment that stayed in the past. But she found me." Grace squeezed his hand. "I saw you were going to be on the show. I've watched you over the years, in your movies, in your interviews. I've seen you become the man I knew you could be. I needed to see you one more time. I needed to know that night mattered." "It didn't just matter," Keanu said. "It changed everything." Jimmy Fallon wiped his eyes, took a breath, and made his way back to the stage. He didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he stood at the front of the stage and spoke directly to the camera. "We're going to do something different tonight," he said. "We're going to keep Keanu and Grace right where they are. And we're going to end the show here. Not because we don't have more planned, we do. But because some moments are more important than television." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've laughed with some of the most talented people in the world. I've played games, sung songs, done sketches. And I love it. I love making people laugh. But tonight reminded me why we're really here. We're here because we're all human. We're all struggling with something. We're all carrying something. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is stop. Just stop. And be present for each other." The Roots began to play, not their usual upbeat closing theme, but something softer, something reverent. "Grace Hawthorne," Jimmy continued, "you are a hero. Not just to Keanu, but to everyone watching this who has ever felt lost, who has ever felt like they didn't matter, who has ever needed someone to just listen. Thank you for showing us what it means to truly see another person." He turned to Keanu. "And Keanu, thank you for your vulnerability, for your honesty, for showing millions of people that it's okay to not be okay, and that asking for help is the bravest thing we can do. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The show ended differently that night. No musical guest. No comedy bit. Just Jimmy Fallon standing on stage, holding his tie in one hand, watching as Keanu Reeves walked Grace Hawthorne out of the studio, arm in arm. As they disappeared through the exit, Jimmy turned to the camera one last time. Sometimes the best thing we can do is stop the show. And sometimes, that's when the real show begins. The next day, that tie, the one Jimmy had worn every night for years, was framed and placed in his dressing room. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. A reminder that beneath all the lights, the laughter, and the entertainment, we're all just people trying to save each other. And sometimes, all it takes is one voice, one moment, one person willing to stop and listen.